information on our panelists, and I think this is important. Haylee Anne. Hi, Haylee. You want to raise your hand? There you go. Haylee is a BFA graduate from Montclair State University. Her work has shown in venues such as the Center for Civil and Human Rights, Mint Gallery, and Soho 20 Gallery. In 2013, she was awarded the VSA Excellent in Artistry Award by the Smithsonian and the Kennedy Center. In 2020, she was a Distinguished Fellow at the Hambridge Center for Creative Arts and Sciences. As an enthusiastic member of Living Melody Collective and collaborator with the Georgia Council on Developmental Disabilities, she focuses on civil engagement, awareness, advocacy, and community impact. So welcome, Haylee. Mär Martinez, in the glowing yellow, beautifully lit at the end of the, has just been awarded a year 2 residency in our AAA program here at A&H. Mär is an interdisciplinary artist specializing in sculptural painting. She received a BFA in painting and a BA in art history at the University of Central Florida. Her selected awards include the JAW Breakers Grant, the Bridge Ahead Initiative Grant, Bronfman Artist Grant Finalist, Jewish Art Salon Student Fellow, Fusion Fest Best in Show, Order of Pegasus Finalist, Catherine K. and Jacob Holzer Art Scholarship, Frank Lloyd Wright Scholar Recipient, and the Miniature Fine Arts Society Award. This October 7th, in an exhibition featuring her work along with Leo Cordovi, who's in the back of the room, and MJ Torrecampo, we will have an exhibition that opens here of their phenomenal work at A&H. So please welcome Mär. So artist and advocate Jessica Caldas received her Master's of Fine Arts degree at Georgia State University in 2019 and her BFA in printmaking from the University of Georgia in 2012. She currently runs the Good News Arts, a small community art space and gallery in rural North Central Florida. She has participated in numerous significant residency programs and received many prestigious awards, including the Center for Civic Innovations in 2016 Creative Impact Award, named Creative Loafing's Best of Atlanta Artists for 2016 and 2015, and received the City of Atlanta Office of Cultural Affairs Emerging Artist in the Visual Arts. So please welcome Jessica. So I'm going to take my mic and I'm going to sit down and I'm going to get the conversation started, and then I'm going to...
Dan, is it okay for me to say one thing?
Please, absolutely, yeah.
So some of the topics that we discussed tonight might be difficult for you, and like my mother, I want to make sure that to remind everybody that you have to do what feels best in your body tonight. If for some reason you become ill at ease and you need a moment, please make sure to take that moment. If you need to leave the room, to get up, to walk around, whatever you need to do. Some of the things we talk about might be difficult, and I just want to be sure that everybody is very aware that I fully support your decision to move as needed through that.
Perfect, thank you. So I really thought the strength of tonight could be that the panelists could just really carry on in an open conversational manner with each other. I don't want to have a strict format or guidelines. I'll ask a couple questions to kind of get things going, and then just please. So the first question kind of is for Jessica, and so looking back at everything that, you know, what has been going through your mind when you thought about this evening's talk, having experienced this wonderful transition from the beginning planning stages to now, can you give us some feelings on that?
Yes. So this evening's talk has really shifted in my mind a lot over the past few months. It was everything from like a more formal panel where Dan is asking us questions and we answer them, or even I was thinking at one point we get a professional in here to come and talk who has like experience in the fields and the issues that we're dealing with to ask us questions about our work in relation to that and things like that. And while all of those, and I'm very excited to have Dan here because I'm not necessarily best at paneling my own work in conversations. What I really wanted, much like Dan, is to sort of mirror the same sort of naturalness with which the written text came through. And like Dan has described before, when we started planning the exhibition, those texts were not really a part of it at first. It was, okay, we need to have someone else's eyes sort of in tandem with Dan's for the curation, someone who maybe has similar experiences to me, and we brought Mär in to kind of initially to kind of help be that person. And then as we moved forward, I can't remember at what point I was like, I think I need some women in my life to write something about these words.
Like the end of March, early April.
So end of March, early April. At what point in the process were we there?
Well, I think it, for me, it revolves back to, and when I started doing research on the conversation and the storytelling going on, for me, it was what we discussed in Gallery 4 was kind of making you instead of a statistic,
Right.
because a lot of women that go through these situations are often just depersonalized, and so
Right.
we thought that involving, I think
Right.
that was the moment, I think.
And also, I think you had asked me to write something about all the work, and I hate writing about my own work as well. Like that's a very difficult task. And you'd asked me to think about that final room, the room with the statistic, right? And that final room was actually the hardest for me to like think about, because I'm in my own head, I'm in my studio, but I don't know what that looks like to other people. And I thought of folks like Mär, who has worked with me and who I've gotten to know and become friends with. And I also thought of folks like Haylee, who's a part of the Living Melody Collective with me. And these are women who have been instrumental to my life, especially not only since, but especially since I had a child. I honestly often say that my first year of motherhood, I don't know how well I would have survived it without them. I was in grad school. My partner and I were struggling through a lot of financial things and like trying to figure out what we were doing with our lives. And I had the collective, these women who worked with me as artists, who were brilliant artists on their own, who we collaborated with, and many of whom are mothers as well, to lean on. And I think it was that point where I was like, okay, well, they're the ones who have an insight to my work that I might not be able to capture. And from there I was like, okay, I wonder if I can convince my family to write still something, because my sister is a brilliant writer, but doesn't publish anything. She's she's unlike me, very behind the scenes. She doesn't like to put her face out there all the time in this way. And my mother is brilliant, but shockingly shy. And with reason, maybe hesitant to always like be forthcoming about some of her experiences. So I was like, okay, convince all these people to write. I'll see if Dan's okay with it, and we'll do it. That sort of, and of course everybody was gracious. And I'm actually very curious, like what you guys felt when I asked you to do this. Because
I wanted to give the context of the other collective members.
Yeah.
So it's myself. My name's Haylee. If you hear me beep, it's because I'm diabetic. I'm the only one in this group that's not a mother. So there's Jessica, and then there's our friend Angela Bortone, who is an Italian-Dominican artist with one child, and then there is Angela Davis Johnson, who is a multidisciplinary artist, an amazing painter, who has 2 children, single mom, and then our friend Danielle, who became a single mom over the course of us becoming a collective. She's an interdisciplinary performer, actor, sculpture maker, one child. So like there's 5 of us, and we all come from very diverse and different backgrounds of anything that you could really find a statistic from, of marginalization, disability, class, status, race. So that's what the 5 of us are together. I don't remember what your question was. About how we felt.
I want to know how you and Mär felt when I asked you to write something for my exhibition.
I was honored and terrified so the one that I wrote about was called Should Want Need, which is this piece that Jessica did. It was her first performance that she did post-birth. And it was like 10 months to a year after the birth of your child.
It was 8 weeks after I gave birth.
Anyways, time isn't real. But the reason why this is significant is because the performance incorporated Jessica like lifting heavy cinder blocks onto her back and carrying them back and forth. So like her body just went through this phenomenal feat of like creating something and bringing it into the world, which is like, no matter what any television show will tell you, it's not easy. It's a process. It's beginning, during, and after process. So the fact that she's like in her 4th trimester, like postpartum, and also working these cinder blocks through her body, and this idea of our shoulds and our wants and our needs, like I was like struggling with, how do I even describe this to people? So instead I really just went with the emotional aspect of, here was my friend in this time of her life, how interesting that she decided to do this performance of different movement when her identity and her life had changed so much. And that's kind of what you talked about with performance. So.
It's funny, I think it was at that moment when you all agreed, and Mär, I want to hear from you in a second, but for me, like you're describing, I'm just going to be honest about this, I'm going to be candid about my experience of it. When I started to get those texts back, that was the moment that I saw that this wonderful thing was occurring throughout the whole exhibition of this kind of like accessibility into very difficult material, and that's what, for me, that's what you guys provided. So, how did you feel, Mär? I mean,
I can agree with a little bit of stress, terror, but also like honored at the same time to be able to be asked to put input onto like an artist's work that I really respect. That was honestly like quite an honor, and I wanted to do justice to your work. And I think that the exhibition came together in the most beautiful way, because I originally started out writing about the sculpture that you see when you first walk in, and then Dan asked me to write something that was more like a preamble for the entire exhibition. And as I took time like looking at each piece, I realized how important it was to see a narrative play out, and one that you could walk through and really experience as something that unfolded. Because if you look at sometimes, like, if you tell a story and you try and condense it into one object, it can seem contained, and I know that there's more to your story. And I appreciated the fact that you really highlighted this idea of generativity and the way that, like, as trauma can be passed through, so, like, strength can be passed through also, and I think that was really something important.
And that's really the truth behind that, oh my gosh, like, having anxiety behind writing this, because, like, we have different levels of knowing Jess, but not only does she create monumental work that serves to speak for things that we don't often want to talk about, but she's also like a great friend. So it's like, oh, I don't want to mess this up, because I have felt so honored to be a part of these different processes, and has inspired and changed the scope of my work. Oh my gosh, I want to do it well.
And for my part, like, I still have a lot of anxiety about asking other people to do things for me that I know are laborious and difficult, and frankly, that I could not pay for. So I was like, okay, here I am, I'm about to ask all of these people I admire and deeply respect to like perform labor for me for free. Like, and so I'm engaging in one of the topics that has become very important to the research I'm doing in relation to all of this work, which is like this exchange, right? I'm asking for this gift from them, which there's no tangible exchange for. And I'm hoping and relying on that sense of like community and like peer, like sort of peer-to-peer like goodness that this is, yeah, that this is an acceptable ask, and that something that is not too much of a burden on you, and that can be eventually one day repaid maybe in some way.
Honestly, it was an honor, and it perpetuates the idea that you are trying to tell in your artwork, like by having a community rally around like kind of a tale that is in part about the singular experience of assault, like that's something that's so isolating, but then to be able to turn that out and create a community between us, and then hopefully within the community as they engage with your story, I think that you were able to double dip and you know, kill two birds with one stone in that process.
You know, to Mär's credit, I had kind of seen where the panels would go in the narrative of the exhibition, and Jessica and I had talked about that at length, and I knew Mär would play this important role in getting that narrative started. And when, you know, I know Mär from being involved with the AAA program. I'm the curator of the program here at A&H. So, but I knew how brilliant Mär was, and when I got the first draft back, she's also very kind, and I saw that she was not wanting to step on my toes because I had to write other panels for the exhibition, and I was aware of that while I was reading this. So the one thing that we did do right, and my staff did right, my director did right, was we constantly, any questions we had, we went right back to the source. So I asked Jessica, is this okay if I reach out to Mär again and tell her, like, because she had written this panel, but I didn't think it was Mär, like, revealing her whole strength and take on it. And Jessica was like, no, please, please. And so to Mär's credit, we met in your studio with Leo, and I said, listen, I'm requiring this of you because the only missing piece is this wonderful entryway into the narrative. And you brilliantly wrote that and submitted that. And to me, like, along with, you know, Jessica's mom, like, you know, everybody has their personal favorites for these panels. That's the thing that's amazing to me. And for me, Mär's and then your mom's were the things that solidified me, that I knew we had something very unique, you know.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I love all the panels, and I think that the one thing that, with Dan's help, that happened really, really naturally as well, is that everybody was assigned the perfect thing to write about. I chose, essentially, I mean, I sort of pretended to let the collective choose which piece they could write about in that final room, but I was definitely, like, guiding it a little bit, because, like, I know them, and I know Mär, and I know my family, right? Obviously, the family pieces are fairly obvious, who's going to write for what, but, you know, Mär and I have a different relationship because we knew each other through work first, and there's some distance there that we're, I think, slowly bridging, which is lovely, but I also know Mär's work to be about these complex narratives and things that are outside a simple binary and duality, and thus her ability to construct sort of the introduction to a very complex narrative and very complex story and series of works was going to be the best. Like there's no better person to write that. And then as far as the collective goes, like Haylee writing about Should Want Need, you know, I thought her writing was very gracious and that it focused on sort of my processing of, like, sort of the change in my body. But I also know that Haylee is a person who, in my experience, understands this dynamic between how we treat ourselves and what we allow ourselves, and in both positive and negative ways, almost better than anyone else I know. And that's because of her own experiences. And so I was like, I kind of need you to write this piece. And Angela Davis Johnson wrote about 3 Every Day, and she is just this dear soul in my life that, I mean, it's very difficult for me to describe her as a person because of the magnitude of, like, my relationship with her as well, but she has sort of been with me constructing and helping, like, in as a, like, phantom, not literally.
She's like a mother nature, but like every aspect of it, like the part that's, like, gritty and the part that is nurturing.
But when I started creating performance pieces, she was also always sort of there in the background, hearing them and feeling my thoughts and, like, helping me construct them. She was one of the first people to hear about 3 Every Day before it was ever a real performance. And that was really theoretically my first performance, although technically Danielle had written the piece. She didn't, her writing will be in the catalog that I'm creating for the show, but she was actually the one who wrote about the technical first performance, which is this, like, in the closet kind of thing I did years prior. But anyway, so, like, in Bortone's piece, I mean, it's just, you know, I'm very honored also to have received these. And because also it sorry, I'm, like, talking.
No, I know, like, one thing, I know, you know, Patrick and Holly Kahn are here, and, you know, they understand the curatorial process and this kind of thing where you know, it's like an architect, you see this grand vision, right, and you want to embody it, you don't want to lose anything precious, but then you realize that there's kind of, like, you know, with an architect there's codes and things, you know, and building codes and these things that try to pull away at the core of the, that kind of wonderful thing that you're trying to nurture. The thing that you did really wonderfully was there was a moment when we were talking about the performance pieces in Gallery 4, and you said, I said to you, well, I mean, we can always put them on a monitor or try to get something like that, and you immediately were like, no, that's not the intimacy I want. I want this to come from these people that outside of myself that have experienced it. And when you said that, I was like, that was that concluding, that punctuation on everything. That was it really did maintain that thread throughout. So I'm so happy that, because if you did do that, I might have thought that would probably be a way to end it, But I remember that conversation distinctly of like, no, I want to camp here, and this is where we're going to end. And so, yeah, so there you go. So I do have a question I'm sorry, Mary, you were going to say something, please.
I just wanted to bring up the fact that this isn't the first time your work has involved the community before. Like, for those of you that are not familiar with Jessica's work, like who Jessica is as a person, she is community facing in both the arts and also in social work. But then your work process has directly engaged community, so I thought that this was an interesting way to also bring language, which is another facet of your work. So I feel like this became a multi-dimensional reflection of like your art career up to this point.
Yeah, and to that point, like when I started making the kind of work I make about domestic violence and sexual assault and all these very challenging issues, when I first started making that work, I was working as an advocate for domestic violence victims in the Atlanta court system. And so I was helping them get temporary protective orders, which is what most of us think of restraining orders. That's what they're actually called. And so much of that process was just listening to people's stories every day, 5 days a week, and sort of just absorbing them and, kind of assisting them with translating it into legalese, and then eventually turning that into statistics to report on grants so that we could get funding to keep helping these women. So there's this process of reducing stories to numbers that I had become very familiar with, and was part of why I began making this work. But it has been, in a way, a long time. I mean, I have done other kinds of community-facing work and continue to do story collecting in other capacities. But this is the first time in a long time that I've been reminded that is, like very directly, that is where my practice as an artist really, truly began. And it has influenced the work that I am considering and creating and researching and building now for the future, because I'm reminded that like my work I love making it, but it stands much better on the support of many, many people's voices. I can do only so much, and does not mean to like avoid my own story or my own impact on that work, but it certainly only becomes like grander through that process.
So I did have a question. It's funny, I did have a question for Haylee, but you asked that one, right? So Mär, from this outside, the role that you played in part of this, from the outside kind of elevated perspective, because you saw it from the beginning, you saw the end, you were present at that first meeting. How do you feel about the way the story and the subject matter were received? Because I remember initial conversations about, how are people going to receive this content? We knew we were going to do it anyway, but now to see it embraced, how do you feel about that? Because I knew you deal with similar things in your work, right? So to see it, does that give you more of a courage to, does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay, good. I know I'm being very cryptic, I apologize.
I like it, it's a little bit of mystery. But I think it came together, because some of the pieces were abstract. Like it wasn't as simple as just, like, oh, this part connects to this one, and then like Jessica was still actively working on some pieces while this exhibition was being planned, and I think that it all came together beautifully, and I know you were experimenting with new techniques, which was really interesting to see, like you working with fibers specifically. And I think that because it was something that started as abstract with a few touch points, you were able to assemble something that really flows like quite lyrically. And I think that you have a great combination of textures happening. Like one of my favorite pieces is the one with the brick about the twins with the brick. I'm blanking on the name.
Dilemma.
Okay, dilemma. But I think that there's like a good interplay between what's happening, like just from a visual standpoint. But I know that conceptually people have been responding to this, and some of the themes talked about are quite heavy in the exhibition, but I think it's been very important, especially considering what's going on with our country right now with the jeopardization of Roe versus Wade. And I think that this has been the exact talking point that we need to be having in our community. It's not necessarily comfortable, it might not necessarily feel fun, but it's a conversation that needs to be had. And I think that A&H is like a place that I think it was the perfect place to have this exhibition because of how intimate and safe everything feels. Like even the scale in the way that you walk through it, I think it's a little bit comforting. Whereas if you were going to walk into a huge white-walled room, it would feel very harsh and maybe alienating or dogmatic. But even the way that then this flows out and then you're in a beautiful, lush environment, I think it gives people time to process and hopefully have conversations about things that have happened in their past, or even just abstractly learning how to care for people in your life. So that's my reaction.
I kind of want to expand on that. When you go see the work, or if you have seen the work, one of the things that Jessica is just like is brilliant at is we're talking about extreme things here that unfortunately happen every day. We're talking about abuse, we're talking about assault. But what Jessica does is she isn't going for like a political ad or like a life-changing jab. She is showing you the honesty and the nuance of all of these little cracks and creases of someone's life and someone's experience. So it's not just like hitting you in the face with like, this is the thing that's happening. It's, no, this is a whole life, and this is a whole life lived experience. And when you are walking through this path of weirdness, you're not thinking about like the cinematic moments. You're thinking about this thing, this letter, and this moment, this thing this person said to me really stuck with me and has altered the way that my life is gone. By using language and by using tools given to her from her family, including history, she is painting this picture that is really like, you can identify yourself in it and you can relate to it. But it's not exploitative at all.
I do appreciate that it's genuinely like a narrative of triumph. Like, you know, after a fire happens in the forest, things continue to grow. So there is that reminder that despite the hardship that is shared generationally, there's hope, and some of that is embodied like throughout. And I'm curious to how your relationship to becoming a mother changed your outlook in your artistic practice, because you were creating work before you were a mom. So I wonder how that shifted.
Yeah, I've been creating this work for years before I had my daughter, and even that before I had her, I was definitely struggling with. There's a couple like big questions that have always been center to my work. Is like, okay, I'm telling a story. Sometimes it's my story, and sometimes it's someone else's story. I'm pretty strict about what kind of connections I have to somebody in their community to allow myself to tell a story. But even still, like, in what ways can you tell that story and be, safe and honor it and not exploitative and not sensational in the way that sometimes I see artists create work around some of these issues. And it's hard for me to see some work because I'm like, I'm not sure that I feel they're capturing a full picture. And it's always been very important to me that it's not a simple thing, because especially, like, as I said, when working as an advocate, like, the stories I'm hearing are not, they're stories of abuse, but there's also like a lot of love, sadly, as a part of that story, and a lot of like humanness, and a lot of all of these other factors of life and circumstance that intersect with them. And it's hard to do honor to all of that because you want to focus on this easy thing and this easy answer. And so how do you not do that in the work? Is one. And then two is like, eventually I got to this place where I'm telling these stories and I'm talking about these things that I felt were very quiet at the time. This was many years ago. I feel like these conversations happen in public ways much more now, which is fantastic. at the time I was starting this work, it still felt like a thing that only some communities really talked about. Like if you happen to be a domestic violence advocate, of course you were having these conversations every day, but if you were not, then you'd still be shocked to learn that it takes a victim about 7 attempts to leave their partner to stay gone from an abusive situation. And a lot of people don't know that fact. More people know it now than they knew in 2015. So, so I was like, yes, I want to tell these stories. I want to make these things common knowledge. I want to erase the myths that are so prevalent around these ideas. But also, like, is that all I want to do? Like, is there a better picture I can be painting about the hopefulness I have? You know, if I believe that, if I have to believe that people are inherently good and that people can change and recover on both sides of the equation, or else why am I doing this work? And so that became actually a central struggle for me for a long time. And when I had my daughter, it became very important to me that the pictures I'm painting, not literally, but kind of literally and also figuratively, like, you know, I want to imagine the world better, right? And I mentioned this earlier. And that's very hard to do some days, especially now, or in the past 3 years. So, but when I had my daughter, I was like in middle grad school, and I'm very hopeful about the world, and I'm like, can I talk about how tired I am and make it kind of funny and make it really honest and make it something that people embrace and go, oh yeah, I feel that. And so like I think that is the biggest change, is like I was able to joke a little bit more in my work and be more playful in ways that I had not allowed myself to be. And partly because I was sort of like, well, I'm too tired to do anything else, so. And I love that happened. And there's still like hardness to some of the work I'm making for sure, but you know, I also am a big reader, as Dan mentioned in the tour, and in addition to like all the heavy research that I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy, and you know, post-apocalyptic fiction that is a little bit more hopeful than dreadful is like my favorite thing. So if you've ever read N.K. Jemisin, is like rock star right now in my eyes of like post-apocalyptic futures that like are a little bit more hopeful than they are like older school post-apocalyptic fiction that's a little bit like we're all doomed. You know, it's a little bit more hopeful. And so I think that, sorry, that's a long answer for where I think I've gotten with my work.
No, but I think that's like what makes it successful, is because you're telling a multifaceted story. Like the hope prevents it from being trauma porn. You know, like pain for pain's sake is exploitation. You know, and you're telling a story where there is redemption and love and softness and the things that equalize like the pain. And I think that that's way more honest than just like a horror shit show. Yeah,
and that's such a, and the thing is, like, I want to be, and this is a really good point, because like with trauma porn, I feel like you also risk this thing where it's like, well, I was like resilient, and now I'm like better because I was resilient. And I don't really love that tone either, because it's like, you don't really want to be like, yeah, this happened to me and now I'm a better person for it. I'm like, yeah, I mean, I'm strong and I got through it, and a lot of women I know are strong and get through it, but like, this shouldn't be happening in the first place. Like, we shouldn't have to be that strong to get through it, you know? So like, I'm resistant, and I think that the work that, and the things that sort of do that, the trauma porn, like this thing where they're just like hitting you over the head with it, like that's where you end up, that's the only place you can go with that as an answer. It's like, well, you got through it, now you're stronger and better for it. And it's like, there's gotta be a more complex answer.
You know, I want to just touch on something that, you know, because my director and I talked about it today, we were talking about this exhibition somewhere else. And I said, I couldn't have curated it somewhere else, because the way these historic, intimate galleries work, like if I tried to put this in a big museum and navigate these big rooms, like the space itself, for me, you know, the major consideration when I, you know, knew of this story and was like that it felt sheltered and protected. And like you said, and then when you navigate through these very intimate rooms where the material is hitting you on a level, but you're not overwhelmed by it, and it doesn't become just an empty artifact in a room. It stays personal because of that intimacy. And then you walk through it and you, like Mär said, you go outside. There's been many last Wednesday events when, you know, I've noticed young people standing in front of a certain piece for an extended period of time and just processing it and having this emotional reaction. And they would walk right through and go out and sit in our main garden and have a moment to process it. And so for me, it was such a wonderful place to have this kind of story, you know, pan out. And the one thing I wanted to give you credit, Jessica, was like, you know, we were talking about these letters. There was a moment in the process where, just from a curatorial point of view, I started receiving all these wonderful letters, and some of them, you know, I just know from a design point of view that there's a certain amount of word count that people are going to stand there and read. You know, like the text can't conflict with the art. You know, it has to kind of have this beautiful dance going on. So, and some of the people were so incredibly connected with Jessica's story that they were writing, like, you know, like for me, like just like for me on a text panel, you can't go beyond 450 words because it dies off after that. And some of the panels, the text I got in was about 800 words or 700 words. And so I would say to Jessica, listen, I have to revise this. And this was about 2/3 of the way through the process for me. That for me was the most emotional thing, of handling this incredible material that someone provided me, that they had put so much care and thought into, but knowing I had to kind of retain the soul of it, but edit it down. But you, like, your kind of playfulness with me during that process of being like, oh, you're gonna get it, like, you know, like, you'll get it, don't worry, I have faith in you. And I'm like, I'm glad you had faith in me. I'm like, you know, I'm not sleeping, and I'm like, you know, but it was that kind of attitude that you had, that you mentioned, about not having this completely heavy all the time, that allowed me to get through the process as well, you know. So let's see, Haylee, has this experience opened any new ways or avenues or possibilities of how you view your own work, or how your own work could be exhibited in the future?
Yes, undoubtedly. The entirety of my relationship with Jessica has positively altered the way that I have thought about myself as an artist, and the way that I have gone about making work. Because I'm a diabetic. I have a survival job. I cannot exist without health insurance. So I have also not had the ability to make as much work as I honestly would like to. And it's really been through, honestly, talking with Jessica and working with Jessica and getting to work alongside her, that it's like learning different ways to be fulfilled as an artist, and learning different ways to, like, be kind to myself in that scope of, like, just existing alone and existing in this body can be creation. But also, like, when I think again about the space, and when I think about Jessica in this space, and then when I think about it with myself, I think about how the sense of scale in her work does not need to be encapsulated by a big room. And so for me, it's helped me to think, like, beyond just going a big picture or a little picture. It's really helped me look in a sense of, like, where's this place in the middle that someone can really intimately engage with my work? Does it necessarily have to be in, like, this big white room? Does it necessarily have to be, like, in this outdoor space that I'm thinking about? So yes, Jessica has changed my life. And I say this story, and it's one of my favorites, but when I moved to Atlanta in 2014 from New York, and I didn't know anybody, and I met Jessica at an art party, and I just thought she looked cool, and I was trying to make friends, so I went up to her and I was like, hey, you look really cool, can we go get coffee sometime? And she was definitely a little like, I guess, sure.
Let me explain. I believe at that time I was going through this period where I was making, like, coffee date commitments and then canceling them because I was sort of depressed. And so Haylee was just lucky I didn't cancel the coffee date, because I actually made it to this one. And
yes.
It was really lovely.
And then so after that, I was able to, like, work with her on 3 every day. And so it's having this collaborative relationship has just been profound and remarkable.
And context for Haylee's work, because I know a lot of us are familiar with Mär's work as she is a sort of a part of the A&H family right now as a resident, but Haylee is a photographer by study, education, but now makes, in addition to photographs, these large-scale, miniature and large-scale mixed media pieces that incorporate photography, journal entries, writing, found objects, the detritus of her own experience with diabetes, to tell her story and other stories of folks that deal with health care issues and things. And these really elaborately pieced together like montages, I'm not thinking, assemblages of the stories. And so she is a storyteller in her own right for a very different community. Not very different, just a different community, another community.
Yes.
Okay, so I just want to go to some questions from the audience, but one last thing that I'm going to throw this out to all of you. So, given how all different people from different groups have responded positively to the work, given and this is something that really only you guys can answer, because I don't have my finger on this, given the current crazy political climate we're in, are you excited about the possibility of museums running to subjects like this, or do you think they're going to run away from subjects like this?
That's a great
They'll
question.
run. I think they'll run here if their founders and their funders want to tell stories that are relevant to what's happening. Because otherwise, I think you're living in denial to just wake up every day and like look at the world and read the news and not get the reality that we live in.
And I think the trick will be for museums, because of course, yeah, they'll run to the stories. And the trick will be like what they do sort of entering and exiting from those stories and those exhibitions. Because I think that's often where museums fail the most. So they're like, okay, let me find an artist that checks these boxes, does this work, has this identity, and they put the show on, and the show's beautiful. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
But I think there's a lot more power in institutions and museums to host more complicated conversations, to take that work out into the community in different ways, to connect to civic action. And I know as nonprofit institutions, people feel in those institutions like their hands are tied, but there's a lot of really specific ways that you can still engage civically as a nonprofit institution or an institution that has specific funding that you have to be very careful about. And I think it's going to be up to museums and institutions like them to figure out how to expand beyond just saying like, okay, we got the work, we got the story in the space. And I think that A&H has been particularly good at sort of trying to figure out how to expand that work as well in their programming. And I've said time and time again, and I will say it every time I'm speaking to a group of people, working with this team, with you and Danny and everybody here, has been frankly one of the best experiences of my artistic career so far. Like having people who understand and trust and believe in the work so fully does not happen at every space, no matter how much they want to show your work or share it. And so kudos to you guys for that.
One thing I do just want to add is that in answering your question of like how spaces will respond, to me, I would be asking how close is this space to their community? How far removed are they from the people surrounding them?
That's a great point.
That are coming here? Because like I think about someplace like MoMA, where I lived in New York and I had the privilege of going to MoMA all the time, but I hated that museum because it didn't represent anything that my life was like right now. And I didn't feel like the people that were putting the art on the walls really understood much of the world that was going on. But you come to a place like here where like, I mean, you followed me on Instagram immediately. I see you, you're looking at all different artists all the time.
Right.
I really feel like if I had lived here, I would have benefited from having a space like this because of the comfortability of having all walks of life come to this space. And so I'm more inclined to think like smaller institutions, smaller museums, regional museums and galleries, like I think they'll get to it first a lot sooner than bigger places.
I think that's a good point. Yeah. Well, listen, anybody, would love to field some questions from the audience. Anybody have any questions for, yes, sir, Trent?
Well, first I want to say thank you for the show. And I don't know if this is a convoluted question, but I'll ask it anyway. When I saw the show, I read about it, saw this stuff online, but when I went to the show, it was a different kind of experience that I was not expecting. So my question is, what in your life has prepared you to be as vulnerable as you are in presenting that work, along with being as vulnerable as you are presenting other people's stories? What has prepared you to do that?
Thank you for that question. That's a very good one. I think I could say there's a few different things that have really impacted me and my ability to do this. And one is my upbringing. My mother and father separated when I was born. They were kind of separated when I was conceived. So they were never really together. Despite that, growing up, my family always lived together, partly because my mom and dad were just not very wealthy, so they didn't have a lot of money, and so it was just cheaper to share a household and raise all the kids together. And my mom, who was queer, or is queer, and was at the time primarily dating women after my father, often her partners would live with us. And so, I've got this household family that I grew up in. My dad's Puerto Rican Catholic, my mom's European white mix, Midwestern lady, and queer, and my grandmother was queer on her side. My dad's parents were super strict Catholics, but very sweet and loving, and so it's I come from this background of just openness. Very extreme openness and support and love, and that's despite, again, just to reiterate, my mom went through some. Sorry, I'm trying not to curse too much, but she went through some hell growing up. Her childhood was full of trauma, just sort of consistent, and yet she was able to break that cycle with us. Even though we didn't have a perfect household situation or whatever, there was never a sense of want or lack, And so I think that's sort of crucial, number one, right? I was very, very privileged to have that upbringing. And then, in college, I got to, experience some of my first bouts of extreme trauma, and that's not fun and not great, and I really wish it hadn't happened, but, and at the time I was not very, in a place where I was able to deal with it. I was raped my freshman year of college by someone I knew. I was dealing with drinking issues, and so I also felt a lot of responsibility and guilt about my experience, that I placed a lot of that burden on myself, which only exacerbated my drinking issues for a long time, and I just didn't deal with it. And so it was many years later when I started working as a domestic violence advocate, which was really just a job I fell into. It's probably hard to understand how that happens, but my stepmother, who married my dad when I was 16, is a pro bono lawyer, and she has always worked in pro bono law for all sorts of different people. And so exposure to her and her work, when she met my dad, she was doing, she was doing some of the hardest work I've ever seen anybody do. She was representing women in prisons in Alabama and fighting for their rights. Most frequently, she was representing mothers who were forced to give birth in chains in prison. And that was the work she was doing when I met her. By the time I graduated undergrad, she was working for the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation, which had a couple different programs, landlord-tenant defense, so basically helping folks in poverty not lose their ability to find housing, as well as the domestic violence program, which is where I ended up volunteering and eventually working. And I just fell in love with this work. Looking back, I suspect that part of the reason I fell in love with the work is that I probably identified a little too closely with this women and people that I was hearing the stories of. But it was also just, and it was sort of a love, a painful love, because I was sitting there absorbing these stories on a daily basis, and it was stuff I'd never heard about. Like most people, I was ignorant to the realities, to sort of the day-to-day realities of domestic violence victims. And I would sit and I'd hear these stories all day long, and then I'd come back the next day and hear the same stories out of 20 different people. And that was the work every day. And it blew me away because, you know, here are folks who want love, who want families, who want to be safe, and have experienced these things, and no one, and they come and then they apologize. They sit in front of me and they apologize. And they don't know what to do, and they don't really want to get the other person in trouble. That's a very common thing. They're like, I don't want this person to go to jail, I just want to be safe. And maybe there's a way they can still see the kids, you know, but I just can't, you know, and like all of that, you know, and it was so complicated. And I remember thinking a lot later on, it was like, I think that's a lot how I felt after I was assaulted. I didn't really want to get this person in trouble because I remember thinking, one, I was wasted, right? It's kind of my fault, right? But at the time, that's what I thought. And then two, like, he was drunk too. He didn't know what he was doing. Or, you know, or like, you know, maybe like someone misunderstood something, you know? There were all sorts of things you tell yourself, right? And you want to believe that the person didn't mean that. But what actually happened a couple years later after I got assaulted, before I started working with the domestic violence survivors, is I ran into that person when I was out. Sorry, you guys are getting like a story that I don't share a lot, so here we are. Buckle up. And I bumped into them at a bar, and it was like sort of my bar, like this place I hung out in Athens and like felt really safe, like my coffee shop bar. This person walks in and he sits right next to me, and I was like, hey. And I was already kind of, like, I wasn't like drunk yet, like, because I think it was early, but I was like, hey, I'm gonna need like a couple of shots now. And this guy, he's like talking to me, and I remember at the time I had a crush on the bartender and I was just like, he was like, I haven't seen you in years. And I was like, yeah, you know, yeah. And he was like, so what's going on? I was like, you know, and I told him, I was very honest with him. I was like, you know, what happened with us? And he was like, yeah. I was like, it was kind of fucked up for me. Like, it didn't feel right. It wasn't right, you know? And he's like, yeah, I mean, I guess I just didn't realize how young you were. And I will never forget that. I don't remember anything else after that because I'm sober now, by the way, if there's any that is helpful to you all to know. But at the time I was not, and I was like immediately like, okay, I guess it's time to black out now. So I, you know, like in hindsight, I suspect that he knew exactly what he was doing. But it took me a long time to be okay with knowing that and be okay with understanding that no matter what situation or state I was in, it wasn't my fault. So you kind of fast forward to the domestic violence work, and it's hard to see that even if it's a different situation, different story, like you just see yourself every day and all the time, and you see it happening all the time, and you sort of like, I'm sort of like, well, if anybody talked about this shit, like maybe it wouldn't happen so much. And I think that's what I started to believe right then, like in that work. It's like, okay, so basically I'm just gonna start talking to everybody about this stuff all the time. And I later realized that is a kind of vulnerability, but it started out, it was just sort of this like necessity for me. And then I got sober a couple years later, and I talked a lot about my sobriety with others very publicly. Again, partly like there was a sort of necessity when you get sober, people, if you're 26 and you decide to become sober and you still try to go out and have a social life, people are like, why aren't you drinking? And I don't know what they expect you to say, like, oh, because I'm just like, you know, taking it, like, I don't know what they expect. So I would be very abrupt with people. I'd be like, because I have a problem. And people would be like, what? And I'm like, yeah, I think I might be an alcoholic, so I'm not drinking right now. And people would be like, oh, okay, I'm gonna. And again, I think, a kind of aggressive vulnerability at that point, because I was still learning how to be this person. And again, I think the work that I was making then reflects that. It reflects more of a depiction of experience and reality rather than any kind of hopefulness. And again, I was still trying to make complicated images, but there was an aggressiveness to that vulnerability that's very different than the work I'm making now. Because I think through reading others and like kind of becoming comfortable in my skin and with these stories and this idea that if you just talk about things, but you don't have to like scream them at people, you can just talk about things, that people will actually hear you. And then what happens is people start to tell you their story, whether you ask them to or not, which is mostly fine. And often I have to sometimes tell people when it's not fine, which is fine. I'm okay with doing that. And I just hope that people hear that okay, because it's hard to take in other stories too constantly. So there have been periods where I've taken breaks from the work as well. So it was a very long answer.
No, that was
that
was.
Thank you.
Yeah. Liz, would it be okay? Do you have a question now?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Well, how many women in a percentage, not like exactly 73% or 22,
I might know it.
How many women go through this?
Sexual assault?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that it's not true. I'm thinking the extent of it.
Oh, yeah.
And I think our society has coarsened over the last 20, 30 years, even, in terms of relationships between men and women.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated to get to these numbers, right? I think the last time I really looked at the statistics for sexual assault, it was 1 in 4.
And also men can experience sexual assault
Yeah,
as
and
well.
men experience sexual assault as well, and I think it's 1 in 6 is the last time I heard. And there's a lot of stigma around men in particular sharing their stories and things like that. And I've always been very honored by men who choose to share their stories with me after they see my work. Because I don't mean to exclude men from the conversation, but I do think there are limits to what you can encapsulate through work. Again, if you're not a part of that community. I'm not a man. If you're not, So, and for domestic violence, 3 every day was about the fact that in the U.S. 3 women die every day from domestic violence, and it has recently actually risen to 4. Now, these statistics are complicated. And I spent a lot of time studying this, especially when I started this work. And statistics are complicated for many reasons. In our culture, in our society, people have not always reported these things there's been a long history of hiding these things, right? So some of our statistics from the past are actually inaccurate. And so 10 years ago, when I started making this work, 3 every day, might have been because a lot of women's deaths that were actually happening from domestic violence were not being reported as such. Similarly, at a time when we're not talking about sexual assault as much, or when there's a greater stigma about reporting, perhaps the numbers are not reflecting honesty in our culture. And so now statistics are rising, but some of that might actually be a reflection on people feeling like they have a greater ability to report and talk about what is happening to them, men and women alike. And that maybe the police are better capturing the deaths of women or others from domestic violence. And so while it is sad to know the statistics are increasing, what I actually maybe choose to believe is that actually we're just getting better at capturing the data, which, it sucks to reduce things to data, but it's also crucial for how we then think about the world and get to a picture of where we can solve these problems. I frankly don't know a woman. I just feel like all the women I know are like survivors in some respect or another, which is very unfortunate. So,
Also, which I've learned from Jessica, these aren't isolated things that don't affect us. I think the statistic that you said that really always stuck with me was a person that is in an abusive relationship becomes 7 times more likely to die if their partner has a gun. So, when we talk about all of the things that...
Oh, that's not... Sorry, that's not...
What was it?
The statistic, I think the one you're thinking of is if somebody's trying to leave an abusive situation,
okay.
there's 70, it's like the chance of them being killed by their partner is 70% higher. So basically, choosing to leave a situation for your own safety becomes actually more dangerous. So this question, one of these, a recurring theme in my work has also been the questions people ask that are maybe not appropriate, but they just don't know. And one of the questions people ask a lot for domestic violence is, well, why did they stay? Why are, and that's not the only answer, there's a lot of answers. There's so many answers. There's kids, there's dogs, there's money, there's resources, there's not wanting to, there's human things too, like care and love and feeling like a person maybe has problems that make them do these things or whatever, So anyways, you were saying.
Well, it really, if you challenge yourself, it really forces you to think okay, these things that are hot topics in the country, maybe you think it doesn't affect you, but it's why wouldn't I care that someone that I might live next door to, if their partner has a gun that was not regulated, now that increases their chance of death if they try to leave. It's just none of this, nothing is isolated, especially if you are, I think honestly Jessica's right, I think a lot of people she knows, myself included, have a degree of, or spectrum of abuse and survival in their life. And it's you just really can't ignore that. You can't ignore that reality once you learn something like that. And it really changes how you look at other people around you and how you vote, thinking about those people.
And I also think maybe that's why data is often presented in these separate little categories, because when it's clean and neat, it is a lot easier to ignore and see how one thing bleeds into another, and these little sample sets, they all are interconnected in some way. When you also counter in the poverty cycle and racial disparity, they're not on little islands. They have nothing to do with each other.
Which, to that point, just so you know, all the things we're talking about affect women of color at a significantly higher rate than white women.
Queer women of color, but the most.
Queer women of color, and talking about things that are not talked about. One of the women that I spent a lot of time speaking with was doing specific research. This was years ago. She was doing research about queer relationships, especially queer female relationships, and how little domestic violence is reported in those relationships. But it is just as common as any other relationship, because domestic violence sees no boundaries. It's, yes, please.
I just want to say, J.C., first of all, I love this museum so much, and I just wish I had a lot more money so that I could support it. But I do love the scale of it and the community connection. But also, I want to say, I think it's something about women's art that is so important right now, because with the war in Ukraine and all, women can make those. I'm saying what but the connections to sensitivities and emotions and the depth of emotion that I hate to say that men can't, but women can do it better. Women are able to more quickly, I think, make these connections to people. As you said, that some people would look at the canvases and then go outside and talk about it.
Yep.
It's what women do, women are able to make these statements. It's part of who we are, or at least the good artists are able to make those connections and make those statements. And whether it be about LGBTQ issues or whether about, my God, in this state, if we are not in need of this, I don't know where we are.
So I will say, I feel like women are trained to be good at this, right? We're taught from a young age to have, and educated and cultured and socialized to have more emotional intelligence than our male peers. And unfortunately, our male peers are often socialized in the opposite way. Toxic masculinity is a whole nother topic that I'm sure I can make a whole series of tired bodies that are just more male identifying and dealing with that, because I can't imagine the kind of stuff that weighs on as on a like a male identifying person. I mean, you know, like that's a whole mess over there too. So I thank you for your sentiment, but I want to be clear that, at least for me personally, I do believe it's more of an issue of socialization and the way that our culture treats this gender binary and this idea that, you know, I mean, I am a victim of it. I definitely work a lot harder than my partner, who is male, to like do the emotional labor in our household. And even though I know better, and I'm like, you know, like it's like ingrained in me, and we work on it together, but we have to be very cognizant of it.
Make use of those things now. Bring it out and make use of it now.
You looked like you wanted to say something.
No, I just had, it's funny, I've had the privilege of, you know, I was really thankful to be to cut my teeth in the art world in New York in the 1980s, which was very gritty and very real, and most of the artists that had an incredible impact on me and my thinking were all women. Very strong women that had to carve out their own space in the art world. It wasn't given to them at that time. And I always considered it an honor that, you know, that these were the people that kind of showed me the ropes. It's definitely affected me in an incredibly positive way about how I navigate through stories now. I can see an incredible advantage for me that I have that perspective that I learned early on about not only their incredible commitment to their work, which was terrifying to me in the beginning, because I wanted to have that commitment, but I realized that I wasn't fighting for something like they were fighting for, and I later on in life I got that, but what you're saying is true in a lot of ways. There is this, in New York, there's, some male artists, were celebrated for having this kind of bravado and, toxic masculinity. There's a lot of sculptors that were given careers because of that, But no, I just, like I said, I consider it I'm very thankful that was my path that I took to get to this place. Listen, what I'd love to do is kind of navigate back to the gallery for what time we have left. Maybe we can have a little bit, if you want to have a little intimate conversation with Jessica or Haylee or Mär over there. But please thank these wonderful people for what they were so